LaVon Wright Bracey has a story to tell. She was the first African-American student to graduate from high school in Gainesville, Florida. That was a long time ago. It wasn't easy then. Oh, not because of academic challenges, or even because she was a defiant boundary crosser. She suffered, not only due to no fault of her own, but because she wanted to create change, to bring justice to the world. But now, in this 2012 election season, Ms. Bracey says that she is motivated for one reason: because of the suffering that she endured during those culture-changing but horrific years. Ms. Bracey is on the front lines of resisting voter suppression in her home state of Florida. She's swimming upstream, I'm afraid, against unjust, draconian voter registration laws. How easy it would have been for her just to give up in 1967 at Gainesville High School. How easy it would be for her to give up even now. How easy and even how understandable it would have been those years ago for her to listen to those who said that God created different races for a reason in order to define separation. How easy to give up in hurt and despair. How easy even to curse God who may have allowed it all. How obvious it would have seemed for her to run in the opposite direction to end her own suffering, to avoid the oppressors, those who actually beat her up. How easy even now to opt out of the process and privileges of citizenship. But LaVon says with determination, I wouldn't have the courage or insight, the determination or the compassion without having suffered the abuse. And so she's pounding the pavement, registering voters. She's calling public meetings to let the nasty little secret out that some are trying to keep others from participating in the democratic process. And she's actively resisting targeted voter registration restrictions that would purge registered voters just in case they may not be citizens. Unfortunately for now, injustice fails. In the name of God. We rejoin Job, the sufferer, this morning, as he understandably gets to the end of his rope. He simply can't take the suffering any longer, or the injustice of it all. Now, in case you missed the first 2 weeks with Job, here's the short version of the story. First, the story of Job is one of the oldest in all of Scripture. It's older than the accounts in Genesis. And the story of Job is something of an allegory. That is, its characters, who are Job, his wife, and 3 friends, the characters are archetypes. That is, they're those who embody timeless human characteristics. So my guess is that we can find ourselves pretty easily in the story. The narratives explore the characters' notions of God and how they interpret and handle suffering, their own and others. Now, we know this about Job. We know that Job did everything right. He had it all. He had wealth and land and family, and on top of that, he was generous to those in need. Job believed in the God that his religion had shown him. The God who is just and good. And he punishes those who violate the law. But things began to go wrong for Job, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. His livestock were all stolen, his servants killed, his house destroyed, and his children also murdered. But Job stayed faithful. He continues to believe in God's justice, thinking that there must be a mistake somewhere. But it keeps getting worse. Job develops painful sores all over his body, to the point where his wife and friends insist that he must have done something to deserve every bit of his suffering. So as you can see, Job has a considerable dilemma. He knows that according to a just God, he hasn't done anything to deserve this suffering. He continues to believe in God's justice and to believe that God wouldn't bring suffering without cause. And yet he knows that he's miserable. So he demands, he wants to take God to court. He wants to question God because he knows if he does that God will make it right. Job knows that everything will be okay if only he can locate God and get this mess straightened out. God will realize that this isn't right. It's against God's own rules. God will apologize and everything will be okay. Only one problem. God is nowhere to be found. But Job, finally at the end of his tether, ready to quit, just can't take it anymore. His best answers and all his remedies have failed, and he has nowhere to go. So he stands there completely hopeless, totally vulnerable. All he wants now is an honest answer from God. He's ready, open to another way of seeing if God will only show up. And God does. But not as Job imagines. God speaks in a way that shocks Job. You remember how Job wanted to take God to court and question God? Well, God shows up ready to question Job and comes to the conclusion. Basically, God speaks and says, "You, Job, aren't God. You aren't even the center of the universe as you know it." Dang. We all might think that from time to time. You notice that the book of Job is called Job. It isn't called Job and Job's friends or even Job and God duke it out. It's just called Job. Job is consumed by his own suffering. The worst anyone has ever known in the whole world. And totally undeserved. Job is self-focused. Sound familiar? I just can't take it, and he falls on his sword. Job, like us, I think, assumes that he sees things clearly, that his views about his life, that his theology, that his pain are all fact. The only perspective there is the truth. But it's time for revelation when God shows up. God is ready to address those rules that Job wants to hold God to. What rules are those, Job? Do you know the rules? Really? Where were you when it all came to be? When the foundation of the earth was built and the rules were set? Do you know how to make rain? Can you give birth to ice caps or find prey for lions? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? Job wasn't. He wasn't even a glimmer in his mother's eye. God seems to say that creation, the world, human history, present lives cannot be understood, Job, according to the principles of moral cause and effect. Job says, no. God says, no. That isn't how it is. Who do you think you are, Job? You aren't God. You're human. One of my favorite writers, Thomas Moore, when a friend introduced him before he was ready to make a presentation, his friend got up and said, "Let me introduce you to Tom. Tom isn't very good at sports. He can't play the piano. He can't cultivate a garden even though he's tried. Well, this went on to the place where Tom was really uncomfortable. And then his friend changed direction. But now let me tell you who Tom is and the things that he does brilliantly. Thomas More said that this introduction transformed him, and it taught him that perhaps we all need to know who we are not so that we can finally get to who we are. Who, in relation to God, did Job think he was? And if this really is an allegory and we are the Job character in the story, who do we think we are? Clearly, we are not God. Now, a little disclaimer. Progressive people of faith often speak of God's presence that resides in all of us. We just heard that message so beautifully in the song from The Color Purple. We can know God, we progressives contend, and rightly I believe, that we can encounter God in one another, and that we can find God within our own souls. But Job and Genesis and many other portions of us, this is not the whole truth. It's truth, but it isn't the whole truth. We are not God. We don't see with divine, eternal, or cosmic perspective, much less from a place of moral perfection or knowledge. So God shows Job the cosmos, all creation in its vastness from a creator's point of view, saying to Job, you ain't seen nothing. And what you have seen, Job, you've seen only through your own eyes. Let me show you now another perspective. Let me show you the vastness of time and space, the variety of life, the wildness of it all. Let me show you its suffering and its hope. So God shows Job a world that includes forces of chaos, a world that functions in freedom, a freedom that can bring injustice, pain, and even cruelty. Hear that one more time. God shows Job a world created by God, that includes forces of chaos, a world that functions in freedom, a freedom that can bring injustice, pain, and even cruelty. God points out to Job phenomena and species, each with their own worth and beauty and power. God shows a timeless world of wild interaction that weaves this fabric of creation. God gives Job a wider view, a larger context in which to see himself, God, and his suffering. Job gets a glimpse of life beyond his own determinations of what's right and wrong, what's just or unjust. He's moved by God's revelation to take an honest look at his own plight and God's position in it all. And he sees, even for just a moment, from God's point of view. Perhaps he thought, perhaps God was saying, how dare you entertain the notion that I, the one who created everything, that I don't care? Do you know how much I love this tumultuous, magnificent universe? Can you see the wild ways of all creation, the life and death, the beauty and pain of it all? Can you even imagine how ostriches survive, or how mountains erupt in the belly of the ocean? And even, Job, when you have diminutive notions of me, when you think that I'm out to judge or punish, I remember you, and that you are a part of the glory. But God's speech prompts humility, not humiliation. God's rhetorical questions are overwhelming to Job. But they don't indict Job in the way that we might assume. I want you to know, God seems to be saying, that rather than coming down and fixing all, rather than curing all your suffering, I need you to know that I created you too for freedom. I promise to be with you through it all. Invited you to live in relationship to me. Who do you think you are? Who do we think we are? We are a tiny part of this vast, beautiful, wild creation. An answer, but not exactly the answer to Job's question about suffering. Or is it? God has created in diversity and wonder and wildness and willfulness and has imbued human beings with autonomy, not the objects of God's manipulation. What Job had seen as God's indifference, cruelty, or capriciousness is a part of the character of creation. God doesn't manipulate or exert power over. Rather, all creation is unpredictable and free. God's creation doesn't exist simply for the human benefit of everything. And God's creation, in its rawness, includes both light and shadow, life and death, beneficence and pain. Who do we think we are? We are human, part of the vast, flawed creation, but with conscience and autonomy and wisdom, with the capacity to deal with moral ambiguity and to choose and to find meaning in it all, to gain wisdom, like our friend in Florida, to gain wisdom from suffering as well as from blessing. To become, through pain, more compassionate, more loving, more like God. Who do we think we are? We're Job. We are Job in this, in that we are the ones to whom God responds, invites into relationship to deal with the hard questions, to share in the hope-giving and compassion, the love and the salvation of the world, to join God in countering hopelessness and alienation, to know that suffering is never about being punished by God, but is a part of creation, to know that God is with us, ready through it all to offer us insight and wisdom. Who do we think we are? We're partners with God, mutually present in the world, in relationship with and to each other. With God, we participate in finding and creating meaning and in putting the world right in our little corner of it. We experience life, including its injustices and pain, to rise above it and to plunge deeply in it, to rise to heights of wonder and to put ourselves deep in life's meanings. My friends, if we cling to God the Judge, or God the Magic Rescuer, we remain impotent victims. We also remain let off the hook of our divinely given role to be healers and justice bringers in our time. So, now that Job's perspective has been broadened, now that the old God view has been deconstructed, now that his questions about blame and justice have been pegged as self-indulgence. Job has some decisions to make. Can he pick himself up, relate to God in this new way, and live? Even though he's pretty clear that being good, even being godly, won't protect him from pain and loss. Even though he'll be proceeding without formulated answers about life and God and consequence, can he make a life? Can he love and hope and continue to seek after God and worship? What about us? Can we make a life without blaming God or claiming that God is on our side alone? Can we make without assurance of reward for our goodness? Without assurance that those who cause harm will get what they deserve? Without a sense of supremacy? What sort of life are we ready to make? What sort of relationship with God are we ready to build? I hope this day that we can rekindle our wonder in the wild mystery of God. I hope that we can release ourselves from the need to be God, from the need to judge or blame. I hope that we can let go of the magic God, the one who doles out rewards and punishments. I hope these things so that we can live freely, and like LaVon Bracey, that we can rise beyond suffering to join with God, to be bringers of hope and justice and love to this broken world. May it be so. Amen. LaVon Wright Bracey has a story to tell. She was the first African-American student to graduate from high school in Gainesville, Florida. That was a long time ago. It wasn't easy then. Oh, not because of academic challenges or even her to run in the opposite direction to end her own suffering, to avoid the oppressors, those who actually beat her up. How easy even now to opt out of the process and privileges of citizenship. But LaVon says with determination, I wouldn't have the courage or insight, the determination or the compassion without having suffered the abuse. And so she's pounding the pavement, ready because she was a defiant boundary crosser. She suffered not only due to no fault of her own, but because she wanted to create change, to bring justice to the world. But now, in this 2012 election season, Ms. Bracey says that she is motivated for one reason: because of the suffering. How easy it would be for her to give up even now. How easy and even how understandable it would have been those years ago for her to listen to those who said that God created different races for a reason in order to define separation. How easy to give up in hurt and despair. How easy even to curse God who may have allowed it all. How obvious it would have seemed for suffering that she endured during those culture-changing but horrific years. Ms. Bracey is on the front lines of resisting voter suppression in her home state of Florida. She's swimming upstream, I'm afraid, against unjust, draconian voter registration laws. How easy it would have been for her just to give up in 1967 at Gainesville High School.